can't hold my body down. Ain't no praise can't hold my body down. Ain't no grave can hold my body down. When the trumpet sounds, I'll be getting up, walking round.
Hello. In this video I will discuss the importance of understanding issues of oppression, racism and discrimination as precursors to developing cultural competency in working with African Americans. I believe that one cannot become culturally competent unless they understand the impact of oppression and discrimination for groups that we have labeled as underserved, minority, and disadvantaged. African Americans today earn approximately 62% of their white counterparts. They are at great disadvantage when it comes to home ownership, value of homes, education level, jobs, poverty, unemployment rates, and health insurance. All of those are indicators of modern day form of racial marginalization. All these domains are interdependent and have a significant and systematic effect over time on this population. Education, for example, determines potential earnings. However, achieving the desired level of education is greatly affected by a family's ability to support their family members' education. It's greatly affected by home ownership. It's greatly affected by health insurance. And abilities of a family to be able to support and prioritize education as a goal for family members. It's a vicious cycle that takes enormous efforts to interrupt and overcome. A number of definitions exist about oppression in the literature. I define oppression as unjust exercise of authority by taking away from an individual or a group their ability to experience fulfillment, freedom, equality, and a sense of control from their competence and right to be able to do so. I believe that it would be misleading and ethnocentric to try to define oppression of African Americans without addressing it in a historical perspective and without keeping in mind the impact of oppression during slavery. Dr. Kenneth Hardy, for example, has addressed the historical perspective and the systems of domination and oppression in a must-see DVD titled Psychological Residuals of Slavery. I believe it would be misleading and ethnocentric to try to define oppression of African Americans without keeping it in a historical perspective and without keeping at the forefront the impact of oppression during slavery. Dr. Kenneth Hardy has addressed the historical perspective and the systems of oppression and domination in a must-see DVD titled Psychological Residuals of Slavery. Among other issues, he identified silence and rage as two current forms of expression of hurt and pain and anger from the effects of oppression and racism. Dr. Nancy Boyd Franklin warned that we should not misunderstand the healthy cultural suspiciousness of African American clients towards treatment systems. And we should understand that in a historical perspective of oppression and racism and their experience with those systems. What we know from research with African American clients, especially those struggling with substance abuse, is that they're more likely to be diagnosed with co-occurring disorders and severe mental illness. They are suspicious and sensitive towards treatment systems. They underconsume most services. They're more likely to be arrested and imprisoned. And the prevalent form of treatment is incarceration without specialized services. Are we as professionals pathologizing and diagnosing into mood disorders and personality disorders, the very normal reactions that Dr. Kenneth Hardy and Dr. Nancy Boyd Franklin mentioned, that they are normal cultural reactions to oppression and racism. Are we punishing those? Are we silencing the issue by not addressing it? If so, it appears to me that we're destroying the key to the healing process, and thus enabling more oppression and discrimination and keeping that vicious cycle going. According to the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, cultural competence is the capacity for people to increase their knowledge and understanding of cultural issues, the ability to acknowledge cultural assumptions and biases, and the willingness to make changes in thought and behavior to address those biases. Cultural competence is necessary at multiple levels, at the national level, the state level, the community coalition level, the agency level, be it the advocacy agency or service agency, and at the individual level, the professional, the counselor. For the purpose of this video presentation, I will comment primarily on the agency level and also on the individual or the professional level. Cultural competence domains at the agency level can be found through policies, procedures, staff demographics. Studies on workforce development have reported nationally that 70 to 90% of staff in substance abuse treatment centers are white, when the population served, the minority population, is about 30 to 40%, with African Americans being the first largest minority group served at about 25%. Similar findings were reported in my state of Missouri from a recent study of Mid-America TTC on substance abuse treatment workforce. They reported that African Americans made up only 10% of the substance abuse counselors, whereas the population served was at approximately 28%. This issue between race and ethnicity of clients and direct treatment staff has not been adequately discussed in the literature. Some researchers say that certain studies did not provide any clear direction. However, when treatment staff and treatment structures lack the culturally competent skills, attitudes, policies, and procedures, the disproportionate representation within staff and clients can become a dangerous combination for our treatment systems at the cost of minority populations and underserved groups such as African Americans, and thus possibly institutionalizing institutional oppression towards these populations. There is a need for personal assessment and change, just as there is a need for more culturally competent systems of care that have policies and procedures that address oppression and discrimination and racism. Terry Cross developed a model for assessing agencies on a continuum from cultural blindness to cultural proficiency. I believe that our treatment systems are challenged on cultural competence, and that there needs to be more emphasis on addressing cultural competency at the micro and the macro level. Terry Cross suggested that for an agency to be culturally proficient, it needs to hold all cultures in high esteem. It needs to invest to the body of knowledge on cultural competence. It needs to hire staff with expertise. It needs to support other agencies in cultural competence. It needs to establish and maintain partnerships with diverse groups to eliminate racial and ethnic health and mental health disparities. The field of social work and other related disciplines have consistently addressed the issue of social justice, discrimination, and oppression. It is worth pointing out that the field of social work is one of the few that has integrated those concepts into the code of ethics, thus in a way instituting or making it a duty and the responsibility of anyone who calls themselves a social worker to work on issues of social justice, oppression, and discrimination. In fact, in the preamble of the Code of Ethics, it writes, social workers promote social justice and social change with and on behalf of clients. Social workers are sensitive to cultural and ethnic diversity and strive to end discrimination, oppression, poverty, and other forms of social injustice. Furthermore, the Code of Ethics directs social workers to the principle on cultural competence, which implies that A, if you're a social worker, you're going to be working with oppressed individuals, groups, and families. And B, regardless of what ethnic group you belong to, you're going to have to examine your own beliefs, biases, and views towards other cultures, and understand the nature of diversity and oppression. It is within this framework that I decided to do this presentation on African Americans. As a white male, raised in a predominantly white society, with negative messages and stereotypes about all other racial groups, I've had to examine and process my own held beliefs about oppression, and I continue to do so. Concurrently with being raised in a society with negative messages about racial groups, I was also raised and lived for the majority of my life in an oppressive communist regime. This has helped me in relating cognitively to other forms of oppression, such as slavery, discrimination, and racism for African Americans. I believe that my professional identity is strongly influenced and informed from my personal values. As such, for me to be able to call myself a social worker and a marriage and family therapist, I need to be able to abide by the Code of Ethics and the values and principles of these two professions. Just as I believe that my professional self is informed by my personal values, so I would like to state that this video is not value-free. Without wanting to impose any of my values, attitudes, and beliefs onto you, I hope that through this video presentation you've learned something new, or maybe left with more questions and maybe an interest into exploring further the issues of oppression, discrimination, and racism, and the issue of cultural competency and the need for culturally competent systems of care and culturally competent professionals in working with minority populations.
Can't hold my body down.